Okay, so trying to be comfortable here. I think, this is okay. Hello, and welcome back to the Daily Bible Reading Show. I am still preparing for a series of talks that I'm going to be giving at a Christian camp. This is with PKVUM, and it's for a camp, a retreat entitled Awakening. And the idea is Christians have been awakened from death to life. It's a picture of how God has raised us up in Christ. That's why being awakened. We've been raised through Jesus' life and resurrection. And this raising is meant to be seen in our lives today. We're meant to live out the reality of this salvation in Christ today. And so, in light with that, displaying this reality of the gospel, the organizers have chosen a passage from Ephesians for me to look at. It's honestly quite challenging. It's quite challenging, but this is Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 8. And it says this: "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth." Okay, so what's this about? It's talking about that transformation. You were once darkness, but now you are light. And that's an amazing thing, because yes, you were once living in darkness, but it's saying that you were once the darkness itself. But now you've been made into God's light. So it's talking about something that God has done, not something that you need to do, but God has changed you. God has transported you. God has transformed you. And it's something that you weren't before. You were once dead. You were once living in sin. But it is God who's transformed you now to be able to live out this salvation for Him. That's why it says, live as children of light. And it goes on, verse 9, "For the fruit of this light consists of da-da-da-da-da-da-da." And this fruit, this fruit is talking about something that is visible. You think of a tree, and the tree is meant to produce these fruits, these evidences that this tree is fruitful, that's been nourished, that it's growing, it has life, in other words. And these signs of God's life are manifested in, it says here, all goodness, all righteousness, and all truth. And notice there, it's talking about fruitful characteristics. It's not just fruitful things. Today I preached the gospel, or I did this video. But fruitful ways of doing things. Is the way that I'm speaking the gospel now, the way that I'm eating my lunch or doing my work, is it good? Does it reflect God's characteristics of righteousness, of truth? And I think, therefore, it's meant to inform the way in which we're meant to live our lives. It's meant to transform our very being, our character. These are character fruits or evidences, goodness, righteousness, and truth. And it adds, verse 10, "and find out what pleases the Lord." And that's very helpful, because it's talking about how we're meant to think of the way we're meant to produce these fruits. We're meant to think about, how does this thing I'm going to be doing today, is God going to be pleased with the way that I'm living my life today? So we're meant to think about it, meditate about it, pray about it, and the fruit of that produces that goodness, that righteousness, that truth. So again, leaning upon God's power, God's ability to bring about this transformation in our lives, but also convicting us that this is a conscious thing we're meant to do today. To live out this salvation. So goes on, verse 11, "have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them." Expose them. Verse 12, "For it is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible." So this is very challenging, because it's talking about what happens when you, as the Christian, you're living out, God's salvation in the light. You come into contact with deeds of darkness. The light comes into contact with the darkness. What are you meant to do? And, instinctively, what we want to do is to run away. Because we don't want to be tempted by it, maybe. Or maybe we don't want to be contaminated by it. There's some wisdom in that. But it says here that we're meant to expose them, verse 11. Verse 13 again, everything exposed by the light. It's meant to be this active response to the darkness. And that's challenging. How do we expose these things in the dark that verse 12 says it's shameful. It's shameful even to mention what these things are. He doesn't want to talk about them. It says it's just shameful. Yeah, you don't want to deal with them, but at the same time you have to expose them. And sometimes you think of those exposés, in the newspapers, exposing some scandal. Is that what we're meant to do as Christians? Maybe in some part. We were meant to produce this fruit of righteousness, and so maybe part of righteousness is revealing all the things that aren't righteous in the world. But let's read on, because I think it helps us to flesh out what this exposing work of the light is meant to look like. So verse 13 again, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible. For it is light that makes everything visible. So that's very interesting. It's exposed not by us, by the light. And when we're exposing it, that thing is meant to be turned into light as well. So there's meant to be a transformation in those dark things as well. The same way that we were transformed. So we're meant to speak this transformation through the gospel into places of darkness, or maybe even to people who are living in darkness. And so I think, again, exposing here might involve, speaking convictingly into situations that are shameful and saying, that maybe shouldn't be done, that's wrong, that's unrighteous. But ultimately, this is the exposing work of the gospel. Because the gospel, it spoke into our lives when we were in darkness, and it changed us. It called us into the light. It made us into light. It helped us to see God's gracious forgiveness that spoke into our lives, that caused us to want to respond to this light. And I think ultimately that should be the goal of any kind of exposing work that we do in this dark world, that we want people to come into God's light, to respond to Christ. Verse 14, this is why it is said, wake up. Wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. And that's what we want people to hear. That if you wake up, if you respond to this, Christ will respond to you. Christ will shine His transformative, gracious, loving light into your lives, and He will turn you into His light. I think it's a very challenging way of living in this world of darkness. It's a very loving way of living lives that display the glory and the love of Christ in this world of darkness. Yeah, okay, so that's Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 to 14. I'm sure there's more I could say on this, but I do find it very challenging. And not just, exposing things, that, hey, that's wrong, but actually speaking in a way that exposes people to the goodness and the glory and the righteousness and the truth of God's gospel in Christ. That's very challenging to me. Yeah. That's my first impressions of Ephesians chapter 5, verses 8 to 14. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless. Bye.